There was a time when I believed family was everything. Unconditional love, support, trust. But one day, that belief was shattered in an instant. It wasn't the world that betrayed me, but the one person I thought would never turn his back on me, my own son. I'd spent my entire life working hard, building a modest fortune, all for him. I sacrificed my dreams so that he could chase his. I paid for his education, supported his ambitions, and gave him everything I could. But as I grew older, I began to notice a change. My son, once so close, started to pull away. He was successful, yes, but something in his eyes had changed, a sense of superiority, a belief that he knew better than me. That age had made me weak. It was one conversation that broke me. Josh, now an adult, told me I was too old to manage my finances, that it was time for me to step aside and let him take control of my money. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just about money, it was about my dignity, my independence. It was about the years of hard work and sacrifice I had made to give him the life he had. But what happened next would shock him. I didn't back down. I didn't let age or his arrogance define me. I took control in a way he never saw coming, teaching him a lesson about respect, wisdom, and what it truly means to trust someone. I didn't just prove him wrong. I showed him that age doesn't define a man's worth, and wisdom is worth more than any amount of money. Mark had always been a man of simplicity. Born and raised in a small town where hard work was the currency of respect, he never asked for more than what he earned. Growing up in a modest home with a father who was a carpenter and a mother who worked as a seamstress, Mark had learned the value of sacrifice at an early age. His childhood wasn't filled with luxury or comfort, but rather with lessons in resilience and determination. He knew that if he wanted something in life, he had to work for it. Mark's early years were marked by long hours spent in his father's workshop, hammering nails into wood, fixing broken furniture, and learning the crafts that would later serve him well in life. It was hard work, but it gave him a sense of pride. He never saw his father complain about the exhaustion of labor. Instead, his father always emphasized that hard work was the foundation of a good life. Those words stuck with Mark, and as he grew older, he adopted them as his own mantra. After high school, Mark decided to take a different path. He wanted more than what the small town could offer. He moved to the city, where he took on odd jobs, construction, delivery work, and anything that could put food on the table. With little more than his grit and determination, he started saving every penny he could. He had big dreams of one day owning a business, a dream that would push him to work even harder. Over the years, Mark built up enough savings to start his own small furniture company. It wasn't much at first, just a small shop and a handful of employees, but he poured his heart and soul into it. The business grew slowly but steadily, and soon, Mark found himself not only owning a company, but also owning property, investments, and a modest home that was all his own. He was proud of what he had built, but even more so, he was proud of the fact that he had done it without relying on anyone else. Every achievement was a testament to the years of hard work and sacrifices he had made. Yet, despite his success, Mark never lost touch with his roots. His life remained grounded in the values of hard work, humility, and a strong sense of family. He never forgot where he came from, and his modest lifestyle reflected that. He didn't drive a fancy car or live in an extravagant mansion. Instead, he spent his days working in his office, taking care of his business, and spending time with his family. For him, family was everything. Mark's wife, Eleanor, had been his rock throughout his journey. They had met in the city when Mark was just starting out. She was a school teacher, and they had struck up a friendship that soon turned into love. Together, they raised Josh, their only son. Mark's love for Eleanor and Josh was immeasurable, and he worked tirelessly to provide for them, knowing that their future depended on the stability he created. Josh was always a bright child, full of potential. From an early age, it was clear that he had a natural aptitude for learning. Mark was proud of his son, but he also made sure to instill in him the same work ethic that had gotten him through life. He didn't want Josh to take his success for granted. He wanted him to understand that everything had to be earned. As Josh grew older, Mark noticed a shift. While he had once been a humble and hardworking boy, Josh's success began to breed a certain arrogance. In school, he excelled, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had built a successful career in finance. He worked hard, just as Mark had taught him, but there was something different now. Josh's confidence turned into pride, and his pride began to make him feel superior to his father. Mark didn't mind that his son had become successful. He was proud of him, in fact, but what began to trouble him was the subtle hints that Josh was starting to see him as outdated. As time went on, Josh became less involved in the family business, and their interactions became more strained. Mark tried to talk to him, but Josh was always busy with work or other commitments. It was as if the more successful Josh became, the more distant he grew from his family, particularly from his father. Mark, however, was content. He never demanded much from Josh. He wanted him to be happy and successful, but he also wanted him to remember his roots. Mark didn't expect Josh to follow in his footsteps, but he hoped he would at least appreciate the sacrifices that had been made to give him the life he now led. The family dynamics began to change when Mark entered his 60s. He had worked hard all his life, but now, at an age where many would be considering retirement, Mark had no plans to slow down. His company was still running well, though he was no longer working at the pace he once had. But in his mind, retirement wasn't an option. He had no intention of sitting idle and letting the world pass him by. However, it became clear that Josh thought otherwise. Josh, now in his mid-30s, had his own career and was thriving. He had built his wealth, and now he thought he knew best when it came to handling money. Mark had always been the one in control, managing his finances with precision and foresight. But as he grew older, Josh began to question his father's ability to manage his affairs. It wasn't that Josh didn't trust him. It was more a matter of Josh's belief that age had made Mark too old to understand modern financial systems. After all, Josh was young, vibrant, and well-versed in the latest technologies and financial trends. To him, his father was from a different era, and that era was behind them. Mark, however, didn't see it that way. Age, to him, wasn't a weakness. It was a source of strength. The years of experience and wisdom he had accumulated had served him well throughout his life, and they had shaped the man he was today. He had faced challenges, learned from mistakes, and come out stronger each time. His ability to make sound decisions had never been in question, and he wasn't about to let anyone, including his son, convince him otherwise. But the turning point came when Josh, with his usual confidence, suggested that Mark should step back from managing his finances. "Dad, you've done enough. Maybe it's time to let me take over. You're getting older. I'll take care of everything for you," Josh had said one evening at dinner. At that moment, Mark felt a wave of hurt wash over him. It wasn't just about the money, it was about respect. Josh wasn't just suggesting he manage the finances. He was suggesting that Mark, the man who had spent a lifetime building his wealth, was no longer capable of making his own decisions. For the first time, Mark realized that the son he had raised, his pride and joy, didn't truly see him for who he was. He saw a man getting old, someone who could no longer keep up with the changing times. Mark was left with a deep sense of betrayal, but instead of reacting in anger, he made a choice. He would show Josh that age didn't define a man's worth. He would prove to his son that experience, wisdom, and independence were far more valuable than any financial knowledge Josh could bring to the table. This was the moment that set everything into motion. Mark had worked hard all his life, and he wasn't about to let his son take that away from him. He was going to show Josh that he was more than capable of managing his own destiny, and he would do it in a way that no one, not even his son, could have expected. And so, Mark set his plan into motion. He would outsmart Josh, reclaim control of his life, and prove that the wisdom that came with age was more powerful than any modern-day financial trend. This was the beginning of a lesson that would change both their lives forever. The first cracks in Mark's relationship with his son, Josh, weren't glaring. They were subtle, small shifts in behavior that over time became impossible to ignore. At first, Mark dismissed them, telling himself it was just the growing pains of a father watching his son mature into an adult. But as Josh's success grew, so did the distance between them. Josh was always a hard worker. Mark could never fault him for that. He had pushed his son to strive for greatness, and Josh had done just that. He excelled in school, earned a degree, and quickly climbed the ranks at a top financial firm. But somewhere along the way, something had changed in Josh. The more success he found, the more he began to see himself as someone separate from the family he came from. Mark noticed at first when Josh started canceling family dinners. What once had been a routine of sitting down together to talk about the day's events became sporadic. Josh's phone calls, once frequent, became less and less. And when they did speak, it was always about Josh's work, his promotions, his new projects, his growing wealth. Mark tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his day, his thoughts, his life outside of work. But Josh's responses were always curt, as if his father's life no longer interested him. At first, Mark shrugged it off. His son was busy. Life in the city could be demanding, after all. But it wasn't just the absence that bothered him. It was the tone Josh had begun to take whenever they spoke. Josh had always been respectful, but now there was an edge to his words, a subtle condescension in his voice. Mark noticed it in the way Josh referred to his own accomplishments. He would mention them as though they were a badge of superiority, not a product of hard work. It wasn't long before Mark started feeling like a bystander in his own life. He was no longer the go-to person for advice or wisdom. Instead, Josh seemed to believe he knew better. He had the fancy job, the high salary, the education that came from the best schools. Mark, on the other hand, was just an older man with outdated ideas. It was an invisible shift at first, but one that grew more apparent with every passing week. The real turning point came one evening, when Mark received an unexpected phone call from Josh. He hadn't heard from him in a few days, and honestly, he was hoping it was just a sign of Josh being caught up in his work. But when Josh's name appeared on the screen, Mark answered quickly, eager to hear from his son. "Hey, Dad," Josh said, his voice flat. There was no excitement in his tone, no warmth like there had been in the past. "Hey, son. How's everything going? We're treating you okay." Josh sighed, a sound that Mark recognized immediately. It was the sound of someone who had heard the same question too many times, someone who had grown weary of the same old conversation. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about," Josh said, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "I think it's time we talk about your finances." Mark was taken aback. "My finances? What about them?" "Well, Dad, I've been looking at things, and it's becoming pretty clear that you're not really in a position to manage everything anymore. You're getting older, and let's face it, you're not exactly up to date with how things work these days. I think it's time for me to take over." Mark felt a rush of emotions, hurt, anger, confusion, all swirling inside him. He had worked his entire life to build something for his family, something that Josh had always been a part of, something he had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into. And now his son was telling him that all that work, all those years had been for nothing, that his ability to make decisions was diminished simply because of his age. It was a bitter pill to swallow. "Josh," Mark said, his voice softer now, "I've worked my whole life to provide for you, to make sure that you had everything you needed. I never asked for anything in return. But you're telling me now that I can't handle my own money? That you, with all your success, think you know better than me?" Josh's response was quick, almost too quick. "It's not personal, Dad. I just think it's time for you to relax. Let me take the reins. I'm only doing this because I care about you. You don't need to worry about the future." Mark took a deep breath. He knew this moment would define their relationship moving forward. Josh wasn't just questioning his ability to handle finances. He was questioning his very worth. And that was something Mark couldn't just let slide. "I appreciate your concern, Josh," Mark said finally, his voice firm. "But I don't need you to take control of my life. I've managed just fine on my own, and I'll continue to do so. If you think I'm too old to handle my own affairs, then you're sadly mistaken." Josh was silent for a moment, as if Mark's words had taken him off guard. But when he finally spoke again, it was with a tone of finality. "Fine, Dad, if that's how you feel. But don't say I didn't try to help." Mark hung up the phone, his hands shaking slightly. The damage was done. The trust, the respect, had been shattered. But Mark wasn't about to let this be the end. If Josh thought he could simply take over and push him aside, he had another thing coming. This was a battle Mark wasn't going to lose, no matter how old he was. It was time to show Josh that age wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. And if Josh wanted to learn that lesson the hard way, Mark was ready to teach it to him. He would prove that wisdom, gained through years of experience, was far more valuable than any modern financial trends Josh thought he understood. The real battle was just beginning, and Mark was determined to win it. The days after that phone call with Josh felt like an eternity to Mark. He had always known that their relationship would change as Josh grew older, but he never imagined it would come to this. A place where his son, the one he had sacrificed so much for, would suggest he was too old to manage his own life. The very notion felt like a betrayal, and it gnawed at him, creating a slow burn of resentment that he couldn't easily shake. But there was something else, something deeper, stirring within him. A mixture of pride, hurt, and determination that had taken root the moment Josh had suggested taking control of his finances. Every day, Mark watched as Josh's life grew more distant from his. There were no more Sunday dinners together, no more casual conversations about old times. Instead, Josh would show up only when there was something he wanted, a decision to be made, a financial move to discuss, or even worse, to lecture Mark on the modern ways of managing money. Each interaction left Mark feeling smaller and smaller, as if Josh was slowly replacing him, not just in the family business, but in the very role of father. But Mark wasn't going to allow this to continue. There was a finality in Josh's tone during that phone call that Mark couldn't shake off. Josh had given up on him, decided that age had made his father irrelevant. And yet, Mark knew the truth. It was Josh who didn't understand the real value of what his father had built, and he had every intention of showing him. Mark began to plan in secret. His first step was to assess his finances. He knew that Josh, now a successful financial advisor, had taken the liberty of looking at the books, his father's business, his investments, everything. It was no secret that Josh had been keeping a watchful eye on Mark's financial decisions for years. But now that the question of control had been raised, Mark felt an urgency to act. He wasn't about to let his son walk in and take what was his. Mark had earned every cent, every asset, and he would protect it, even if it meant doing so behind Josh's back. Over the next few weeks, Mark worked in quiet solitude. He consulted his trusted accountant, reviewed his investments, and made a series of transfers, moving his wealth into various assets that Josh couldn't easily access. He spread his money across different accounts, diversified his holdings, and made sure his assets were locked up tight. It wasn't the most modern or flashy approach, but it was one he trusted, a way of managing his wealth that had worked for him for decades. The more Mark worked, the more the hurt of Josh's words ate away at him. It wasn't the loss of one evening, after a long day of organizing his affairs. Mark sat alone in his study, staring at the family photos on the wall. There was one picture in particular that caught his eye. Josh, just a child, standing proudly next to him on Mark's first big construction project. Mark's heart swelled with pride as he remembered the young boy he had raised. Back then, Josh had looked at him with admiration, as if everything Mark did was the right way. But now, that admiration had been replaced with doubt. Mark's chest tightened as he realized how far they had drifted. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about respect. It was about showing Josh that his father was not some relic of the past, someone who could be discarded and replaced. Mark was still capable of making decisions. He was still capable of being the man he had always been, the man who had worked tirelessly to build a legacy, to create something meaningful. And so, Mark made a decision. He would take back control, not just of his finances, but of his life. He would prove to Josh that experience and wisdom were not to be dismissed or underestimated. Josh thought he had all the answers, but Mark knew that the real test was coming. It wasn't just about managing money. It was about understanding the deeper values that Mark had built his life on. But Mark knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be consequences, of course. Josh wouldn't accept it gracefully. He would fight back, no doubt, trying to convince his father that he was only looking out for him. But Mark was prepared. He was ready for the confrontation, ready to show Josh just how wrong he was about his father's abilities. In the quiet of the night, with only the soft ticking of the clock in the background, Mark sat back in his chair and exhaled deeply. It was time to reclaim what was his wealth, his dignity, and most importantly, his relationship with his son. The battle for respect had begun, and Mark was determined to win it, no matter the cost. But there was something about Josh's attitude that struck deeper than any financial decision. As Mark worked, the thoughts of their past together flooded his mind. The countless hours spent together when Josh was a child, the father-son moments, the pride Mark had felt watching his son grow into a successful man. The memories were bittersweet now, tinged with the realization that everything had changed. Josh no longer seemed to care about what Mark had to offer, not just financially, but emotionally. He no longer saw his father as a mentor, someone to look up to. He saw him as a relic of the past, someone who had outlived his usefulness in a world where success was measured in numbers and profits. One evening, as Mark was reviewing some papers in his study, his phone rang. He looked down at the screen. It was Josh. Mark hesitated for a moment, then answered. He wasn't sure what this call would bring. The last time they had spoken, things had been tense, with Josh trying to convince Mark to let go of his finances. The phone call was the last thing Mark expected, but at this point, it seemed inevitable. "Dad," Josh's voice came through, sounding different this time, more tired, more strained. "We need to talk." Mark felt a surge of frustration, but tried to stay calm. "What about?" "I've been thinking," Josh began, pausing for a moment. Mark could almost hear the uncertainty in his son's voice. "About what I said, about taking over your finances. And I realize now that I pushed too hard. I didn't consider how it made you feel. I'm sorry, Dad." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected an apology. It was almost as if Josh had recognized the gravity of the situation for the first time. But Mark was still too hurt, too proud, to accept the apology immediately. "I appreciate you saying that," Mark replied, his voice steady. "But that's not the point, Josh. It's not just about what you said. It's about what you think. You didn't trust me. You didn't trust that I could manage things myself. You think I'm too old, too out of touch." There was a pause on the other end, and Mark could tell Josh was struggling with how to respond. Finally, he spoke again. "I didn't mean it like that, Dad. I was just worried, you know? I didn't want you to get hurt, especially with everything that's changing. I didn't want you to be left behind." Mark felt a pang of sorrow. It wasn't that Josh didn't care. It was that Josh's definition of caring was so different from his own. Mark had built his life by working hard, learning from mistakes, and never taking shortcuts. But Josh, in his desire to protect him, had decided that Mark couldn't handle things on his own. It was the ultimate insult, even if Josh didn't mean it that way. "I don't need protecting, Josh," Mark said, his voice firm. "I've been managing just fine for a long time, and I don't need you to take over. Not now, not ever. I've taught you everything you need to know. It's time for you to trust that." There was silence again, and for a moment, Mark wondered if Josh had given up on trying to mend things. But then, Josh spoke again, quieter this time. "I never wanted to take everything away from you, Dad. I just wanted to make sure you're taken care of. But maybe I was wrong about you. Maybe I should have trusted you more. I just didn't want to see you struggle." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. Josh was right about one thing. He had been wrong. Mark had never struggled to manage his own life. But the deeper issue was that Josh didn't truly understand the value of what Mark had built, nor the strength that came with experience. "I appreciate your concern, Josh," Mark replied, his voice softening, "but I don't need you to save me. I've been doing this my whole life, and I'll keep doing it. What you need to understand is that it's not about how much you can protect me or control. It's about respect. You've forgotten that, and that's what hurts the most." Josh was silent again, and Mark could tell the weight of his words had hit home. For the first time, Josh seemed to truly understand the depth of his mistake. Mark wasn't just a man trying to hold on to his wealth. He was a man who had fought for everything he had, a man who had always fought for his dignity. And that was something Josh had to learn to respect. "I know," Josh finally said, his voice small. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." Mark exhaled deeply, the anger in his chest beginning to settle. He wasn't sure if this conversation would change anything between them. But at least now, for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of understanding. A small but significant shift that maybe, just maybe, could rebuild the bridge that had been broken. But Mark knew it wasn't over yet. The road to regaining his son's respect and ultimately rebuilding their relationship was still long and uncertain. He would have to prove himself again, not just as a man who could manage his finances, but as the father who had always been there, who had always known what was best, even when it wasn't the easiest path. The battle for their relationship wasn't over. But for the first time, Mark believed there was hope. The week after the phone call with Josh was a strange one for Mark. There was a sense of relief that lingered in the air, but also an undercurrent of uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he felt a shift, both in his relationship with Josh and in how he viewed himself. The conversation had been a turning point, but Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things weren't truly resolved yet. Apologies and words of remorse could only go so far. He needed to see action, needed to feel that Josh truly understood what was at stake. For Mark, actions had always spoken louder than words. Mark spent the next few days walking the same path he had for decades, managing his business, overseeing his investments, and quietly fortifying the foundation he had worked so hard to build. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't ignore the thought that Josh was still out there, convinced that he was the one with the answers. Mark was sure that Josh thought he had done the right thing by offering his help, that he had stepped in with good intentions. But Mark was beginning to realize that the real problem was not about financial management. It was about respect, independence, and the unspoken belief that experience at a certain point in life meant less than fresh ideas. One evening, as Mark sat in his study reviewing financial statements, he heard the familiar sound of Josh's car pulling into the driveway. He didn't need to look out the window to know it was him. It had become a predictable rhythm in their strained relationship. Josh would stop by when he had something to say, when he felt the need to check on things, or when he thought his father might need help. Mark had grown accustomed to the visits, though he no longer greeted them with the same enthusiasm he once did. "I guess I thought I was just trying to help," Josh said, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought if I stepped in, I could make things easier for you. But I see now that what I was really doing was taking away your power. I was trying to control things that weren't mine to control." Mark looked at his son for a long moment, letting the words sink in. This was the moment he had been waiting for, an acknowledgement of the deeper issue. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust, power, and the belief that his father was no longer capable of making decisions on his own. Josh wasn't just apologizing for trying to take over his finances. He was acknowledging the fact that he had undermined Mark's independence, something that Mark had fought for his entire life. "You weren't just trying to help, Josh," Mark said, his voice steady. "You were trying to fix something you thought was broken. But the thing is, I wasn't broken. I've never been broken. I've been managing just fine, and that's what you didn't see." Josh looked down, his hands clenched tightly on the table. "I didn't understand that, Dad. I thought I was just being a good son, taking care of you, making sure everything was okay. But now, I see how wrong I was." There was a pause, a heavy silence hanging between them. Mark's chest tightened as he thought about all the years he had spent teaching Josh the importance of independence, of standing on his own 2 feet, of never letting anyone else define his worth. And now, Josh was asking for that lesson to be understood, but it came at a cost. The damage had already been done. Mark had already seen the cracks in their relationship, the assumptions that had been made, the trust that had been broken. "You've got to understand something, Josh," Mark continued, his voice softer now. "It's not just about managing finances. It's about my dignity, my ability to make my own decisions. When you told me I wasn't capable of handling things anymore, you didn't just question my ability to manage money. You questioned my entire sense of self. I've been independent my whole life. I fought to get where I am, and I'm not about to let anyone take that from me." Josh sat quietly, absorbing his father's words. Mark could see the conflict in his eyes, the realization that his good intentions had caused deeper damage than he had understood. It wasn't enough to say he was sorry. The trust had been broken, and it was going to take more than just words to rebuild. "I'm sorry, Dad," Josh said again, his voice low. "I never realized how much you valued your independence. I thought I was doing what was best, but now I see that I was only seeing things from my perspective. I never stopped to think about how you felt." Mark nodded, his gaze steady. "That's the problem, Josh. You didn't see things from my perspective. And I'm not angry anymore. but I'm not going to let this go either. I've spent my life making my own decisions. And if I'm going to keep doing that, I need you to respect it. I need you to trust that I can still make my own choices." Josh swallowed hard, his emotions clearly at the surface. "I understand, Dad. I really do. And I respect that. I just hope you know that I wasn't trying to undermine you. I was just trying to help." Mark sat back, looking at his son, who was no longer the confident, ambitious young man he had once been, but a son who was beginning to understand the value of humility. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Josh was starting to see what had been missing all along. The understanding that true respect wasn't about giving someone what they thought they wanted. It was about recognizing their worth, their strength, and their independence. The silence between them stretched for a moment longer, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't filled with tension. It wasn't a silence of unspoken conflict. It was a silence of mutual understanding, a recognition of the weight that both of them had carried for far too long. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice softer than before. "It's going to take time, Josh, but we can rebuild. We can get back to where we were. But you need to understand, this isn't just about me managing my finances. It's about me managing my life. And you need to trust that." Josh nodded, a slow, steady nod that Mark knew was genuine. "I will, Dad. I promise." In that moment, Mark knew something had shifted. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. The journey to healing would be long and complex, but for the first time in a long time, Mark believed that they could get there. He would prove that experience wasn't just a measure of time. It was a measure of strength, resilience, and wisdom. And that, no matter how old he was, no matter how much Josh had grown, Mark would never stop fighting for his dignity, his independence, and the relationship with his son. The weeks following their conversation were filled with an uneasy calm, a fragile truce that hung between Mark and Josh. Mark continued to manage his life as he always had, quietly and efficiently, but with an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could ignore. There was no grand gesture of reconciliation, no immediate change in the way things were. But there was a shift, a subtle one. Josh was no longer pushing to take control. Instead, he began to pull back, allowing his father the space to make his own decisions, albeit cautiously, and still with a lingering doubt about his father's capabilities. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt. Mark knew that trust was something that took time to rebuild, especially after Josh had questioned his ability to manage his own life. The wounds were deep, but they weren't beyond healing. At least, that's what Mark hoped. Then came the day when everything changed. It was an event, not some explosive confrontation that would mark the end of their strained relationship. It wasn't a moment when Josh would finally accept the lessons Mark had tried to teach him all these years. It came in the form of a single phone call, a call that shook Mark's world and forced him to face the consequences of his actions. Mark had just finished dinner when the phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID, and his stomach sank when he saw Josh's name. It had been a few days since they had spoken, and even though things had seemed to be moving in the right direction, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still unresolved. He picked up the phone, unsure of what kind of conversation this would be. "Hey, Dad." Josh's voice came through a bit strained. "We need to talk." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The tone of Josh's voice was different from the apologetic, reflective tone he had heard the last time they spoke. There was a sharpness to it now, a sense of urgency that immediately put Mark on edge. "About what?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "What's going on?" Josh hesitated before responding. "I've been looking at the numbers, and I noticed something that doesn't sit right." Mark frowned. He had always been meticulous with his finances, and if there was a mistake, it would have been caught long before now. "What do you mean? What numbers?" "There's a lot of money that's been moved around, Dad. A lot. And I don't know what's going on, but it's not what you told me it was." Mark's stomach tightened. His first instinct was to deny it, to reassure Josh that everything was fine, that there was nothing wrong. But the reality of the situation hit him with full force. He had moved his money around, spread it out in different accounts, diversified his assets in ways Josh would never understand. He had done it quietly, without consulting anyone, and certainly without telling Josh. But now, his son had discovered the changes, and there was no turning back. Mark felt the weight of the decision he had made, to take control, to ensure that his wealth was secure and beyond Josh's reach. But it was a decision that came with consequences, ones he hadn't fully considered. Now, Josh was questioning him, and Mark wasn't sure how to explain himself without risking further damage to their relationship. "Josh," Mark said, his voice steady but firm, "I did what I thought was necessary. I didn't want to put you in a position where you felt like you had to take over everything. I moved the money to protect it, to protect myself." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mark could hear Josh's breath, shallow and measured. It wasn't anger Mark could hear. It was confusion, disbelief. "You moved the money behind my back?" Josh finally asked, his voice cracking. "You didn't think to tell me? To at least consult with me before you did something like that?" Mark closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his son's words. "I didn't want you to think I needed you to make decisions for me. I didn't want to burden you with my problems. I thought it would be better this way. But that's just it, isn't it?" Josh shot back, his voice growing more intense. "You didn't think I needed to be part of this. You didn't think I should be included in the decisions that affect both of us. You took control without even telling me. And now, I'm left trying to figure out what's going on with everything." Mark's pulse quickened. He understood Josh's frustration. He had cut him out of the process, and now, Josh was facing the consequences of that decision. Mark had assumed that by protecting his wealth, he was protecting his son from having to deal with the burden of it all. But now he realized that in doing so, he had created an even greater divide between them. A divide built on a lack of trust, a lack of communication, and a complete disregard for how Josh might feel about the decisions Mark had made. "I thought I was doing what was best for us," Mark said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have been more open with you." Josh was silent for a long time, the quiet stretching between them like a heavy fog. Mark could hear his son's breath on the other end of the line, and he knew that Josh was processing everything he had just heard, everything that had led to this moment. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Dad," Josh said finally, his voice soft but laced with a deep hurt. "I don't know if I can trust anything you say. You've been doing things behind my back for months, and now I don't know where we stand. How am I supposed to believe that you have my best interests at heart when you've been making these decisions without telling me?" As the conversation ended, Mark knew that this was only the beginning of the true battle. The battle for redemption. The battle for reconciliation. The battle for a father and son to find their way back to each other. And for the first time, Mark wasn't sure where the path would lead, but he knew that he couldn't stop fighting for what mattered most. Mark sat in his study long after the phone call with Josh ended. The silence that filled the room seemed heavier than the years of hard work he had put into building his life, his legacy. The echoes of Josh's words still reverberated in his mind, like a distant drumbeat. "How am I supposed to trust you again?" It was a question that had no easy answer, and for the first time in his life, Mark was left wondering if the choices he had made, decisions meant to preserve his family's wealth and independence, had actually driven a wedge that might be impossible to bridge. For a long time, Mark remained in his chair, staring out the window. The lights of the city twinkled below, a stark reminder of everything he had achieved. But the glow seemed dimmer now. The pride he once felt in his self-made success seemed hollow in the face of the fracture between him and Josh. The worst part was, deep down, he knew that he had brought this upon himself. He had let pride guide him. In trying to protect Josh from the burden of managing their finances, he had isolated him, made decisions without consulting him, and, most importantly, had denied him the trust he so desperately needed. When Mark finally stood up, it wasn't just to pace the room or drown in his thoughts. It was to act. He knew he had to confront the damage he had caused head-on, even if it meant facing his son and admitting his mistakes. If there was any hope of healing, it had to start with him. He could no longer let his fear of losing control dictate his actions. What mattered most now was restoring the trust between them. And that meant doing something he had never done before. Being vulnerable, being honest, and showing Josh that he wasn't just a man who could make decisions. He was a father who cared deeply, who could still learn and grow. When Mark arrived at Josh's apartment building, he paused for a moment before stepping out of the car. His heart raced, his hands slightly trembling as he approached the door. He didn't know what to expect when he knocked, whether Josh would open it with anger, frustration, or if he would even open it at all. But Mark knew this was the moment. It was now or never. The door swung open, and there was Josh standing before him, looking weary but not entirely surprised. There was an uncertainty in his eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Maybe hope, maybe just a glimpse of the son who still wanted a connection with his father, despite everything that had happened. "Dad," Josh said, his voice softer than before. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you, Josh," Mark replied, his voice firm yet filled with an emotion he wasn't used to showing. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, and I know that I've taken decisions away from you without your input. But I need you to understand something. I was trying to protect us, protect you. But in doing so, I pushed you away. I should have trusted you. I should have trusted you to be a part of this, a part of the decisions that affect both of us. I failed you, Josh." Josh looked down, his jaw tightening. He seemed conflicted, as if he didn't know whether to be angry, to cry, or to let his walls down. It wasn't the confrontation Mark had expected, but it was real, and that was the most important thing. "I didn't understand, Dad," Josh said quietly. "I didn't understand why you kept pushing me away. You always told me I had to be independent, but now it feels like you don't think I'm capable of making my own choices. That hurt. I never wanted you to feel that way," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always wanted what was best for you, and I made a terrible mistake thinking that keeping you out of these decisions would protect you. I was wrong." Mark took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Josh, who had yet to look up from the floor. The silence between them was thick, but Mark didn't falter. "I should have trusted you, Josh," Mark continued. "I should have included you in the process, in the decisions that affect our future. But I didn't, and now I have to face the consequences of that." Josh's eyes met his father's, and there was a shift in the air between them. For the first time in weeks, Mark saw the smallest flicker of understanding in Josh's expression. There was still pain there, but there was also something else, a recognition that perhaps his father wasn't the villain in this story. Maybe, just maybe, there was still room for them to rebuild. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The weeks that followed the night Mark had gone to Josh's apartment were transformative, not just for their relationship, but for Mark himself. He knew that rebuilding trust couldn't happen overnight, but the conversation they had that night was a pivotal moment, a spark that could reignite the connection they had once shared. For the first time in months, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about mending the rift with Josh. It was about understanding each other better, about acknowledging the flaws and mistakes on both sides, and, above all, about the willingness to grow. Mark didn't expect Josh to forgive him immediately, nor did he expect things to go back to how they once were. But he knew that change was possible. Change would come through actions, through time, and through consistent effort to rebuild their relationship. Mark had been so focused on protecting his wealth, his independence, that he had failed to protect the most important thing, his relationship with his son. He had been blinded by fear, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as weak or incapable. But in letting go of some of that control, he was beginning to see what truly mattered. Josh, too, had his own journey to make. He had always been driven, confident in his career and his ability to succeed. But somewhere along the way, his ambition had clouded his judgment, and he had failed to see the value in his father's wisdom and experience. He had tried to take control of his father's life, believing that it was the right thing to do. But now he understood the depth of the harm that could cause. The trust that had been broken couldn't simply be fixed with an apology. It required real, meaningful change. As the weeks passed, Mark and Josh began to spend more time together, slowly and carefully rebuilding their bond. The family dinners, once a rare event, began to happen more frequently. They didn't talk about business or finances at first. They simply talked about life, about the things that mattered, about their memories together, about what they had both learned. There was still tension, still moments of awkwardness, but there was also something new, a sense of mutual respect that had been lost for a long time. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard, sharing a quiet meal, Josh turned to Mark with a hesitant but sincere expression. Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, looking down at his plate before meeting his father's eyes. About how I pushed you away, how I tried to control things. I know it wasn't just about money. It was about not trusting you, about thinking that I could fix everything. And I realize now that I've got a lot to learn from you. Mark listened quietly, his heart swelling with pride. Josh wasn't just apologizing. He was acknowledging the deeper issues that had fueled the rift between them. This wasn't about one mistake or one phone call. It was about a pattern of behavior that had built up over time. And for the first time, Josh was beginning to understand the lessons Mark had spent a lifetime learning. I've always wanted you to be successful, Josh, Mark replied softly, but I never wanted you to lose sight of what's really important. It's not about how much you have or how much you can control. It's about who you are and the people you surround yourself with. Josh nodded, his eyes focused on his father. I get that now, Dad. I think I've been so focused on getting ahead that I forgot what really matters. I forgot what you taught me, but I want to make it right. Mark smiled, a warmth filling his chest. It's not about perfection, son. It's about progress. We both have our flaws, and we both make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them, and we work together. From that point on, things are different. The cracks in their relationship were still there, but they were being filled with understanding, with patience, and with a renewed sense of trust. Mark stopped making decisions in isolation, and Josh stopped trying to control everything. They found a middle ground, one where their differences didn't divide them, but strengthened their bond. Mark also realized something profound. In his pursuit of independence and self-sufficiency, he had neglected the importance of vulnerability. He had been so focused on protecting his wealth that he had forgotten the one thing that was irreplaceable, his family. For all the success he had achieved, it was the relationships he had built over the years that truly defined his life. His wealth wasn't just about money. It was about the love, respect, and legacy he could pass on. One afternoon, as Mark and Josh were walking through the park, Mark turned to him with a thoughtful expression. You know, Josh, when I started this business, I didn't do it for the money. I did it to provide for you, to give you the chance to have a better life. But what I've learned is that none of that matters if you don't have the people you love by your side. Josh looked at his father, his expression serious. I know, Dad. I've been so focused on the wrong things. But I'm starting to see what you meant all along. It's not about the money or the success. It's about the people you care about and the impact you make in their lives. Mark nodded. Exactly. And I want you to remember that. No matter where life takes you, no matter how successful you become, never forget what really matters. In that moment, Mark knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more decisions to be made, and more lessons to learn. But what mattered was that they had taken the first step. They had acknowledged their mistakes. They had begun to rebuild, and they had rediscovered what it meant to trust and support each other. As they continued their walk through the park, side by side, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The distance between him and Josh had been bridged, not by money, not by control, but by understanding, by a willingness to learn from the past and move forward together. And that, Mark realized, was the real legacy he had built. Not the wealth, not the business, but the love and respect between father and son. That was the foundation upon which everything else rested. The final message was clear. True wealth lies not in what you have, but in the relationships you nurture and the trust you build. It's never too late to rebuild, to heal, and to grow together. Have you ever felt that gap between you and someone you love, whether it's a family member, a friend, or even a colleague? Maybe it's from a mistake, a misunderstanding, or even just growing apart over time. Trust can be fragile, and it often takes a lot to rebuild once it's been broken. But the good news is, it's never too late to make a change. If you're in a situation where you feel like something's missing in your relationships, whether it's trust, communication, or just the bond you once had, take that first step. Start the conversation. Acknowledge the mistakes, own up to them, and show the people you care about that you're ready to make things right. You don't have to have all the answers, but being vulnerable and willing to listen can make a world of difference. In my own journey with my son, it wasn't about perfecting everything or immediately fixing every hurt. It was about showing up, being honest, and letting go of pride to make room for understanding. Relationships take time, patience, and effort, but they're worth it. If you're finding yourself in a similar situation, I encourage you to reach out. Whether it's a family member, a friend, or anyone you've been distant from, ask yourself, what can I do to reconnect? Take that first step, even if it feels uncomfortable. You might just find that the bridge you thought was burned can be rebuilt with a little love and understanding. Remember, trust isn't just built on what you do, it's built on who you are and the willingness to be there for the ones who matter most. If you found this story meaningful, share your thoughts in the comments below. How have you rebuilt trust in your own life? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me for more stories that explore the power of second chances.